Welcome to the program. It's not often in this hung parliament with its hyper-partisan and fairly combative atmosphere that you see both the Prime Minister and opposition leader sitting on the same side of the chamber on a contentious issue. But that's exactly what happened this week. And what was the issue that brought Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott together? Well, it was gay marriage. The two leaders were both voting against it, as did the majority of Parliament in both the lower and the upper house. So was the end result a setback or not for the cause, for the advocates of gay marriage? Well, joining us this week to look at this and the other big issues in politics during the week, Julian Leeser. He's the former Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre. Bruce Hawker, a Labor campaign strategist with campaigns and communications. Cassandra Wilkinson, an author, columnist and former Labor staffer. And Bruce Billson is the Shadow Minister for Small Business, Competition Policy and Consumer Affairs. We were also due to be joined tonight by the Minister for Veterans Affairs, Warren Snowden. He has unfortunately had to pull out at the very last minute because of a family crisis. We wish him well, and we thank you all for being here this evening. I want to start on the issue of gay marriage. Cass, what do you think? Was the end result, the vote yesterday in the House and the vote this afternoon in the Senate, on separate bills but both rejecting the idea of gay marriage, was this a step forward, as some advocates have suggested, or not?
Well, a lot of people are trying to paint this as a step in the right direction, and you can certainly appreciate why what looks to be a likely compromise and agreement on civil unions would be presented as a step in the right direction. But I do think that the Parliament's comprehensively rejected the idea that there's a basic equality test here. And as much as I have defended Julia when plenty of people wouldn't in the recent times, to see her on that side of the chamber knowing that, you know, she's not in a conservative religious relationship herself, that she's had the benefit of a society agreeing that women should be equal to men, to have her not agree that gays should be equal to straights.
Well, it's not just that she's single, atheist, all those things. She hasn't really mounted a powerful argument against gay marriage, to my mind, anyway.
There is no powerful argument against gay marriage.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. But is this a credibility issue, do you think, for the PM to be?
Oh, look, I think everybody looks at that and just thinks you can't have a fundamental religious objection. It surely is being done for polling purposes rather than particular issue of conviction. It just looks transparent.
Well, we knew which way she was going to vote, and the vote itself was largely overshadowed by the remarks of Cory Bernardi that day that we'll get to in a moment as well. But Bruce, do you agree that there's in a lot of voters' minds at least, a credibility question when they see this Prime Minister voting against gay marriage?
I guess people can ask that question, but you know, I don't think you necessarily have to be religious to believe that it's an institution for men and women. And that's where she's come down on the issue. I think politicians are driven by all sorts of considerations when they vote on these issues. I don't think it's just their own opinions.
Was politics one of those considerations, do you suspect?
Look, I think for all politicians it's a consideration as a general proposition, particularly something as sensitive as this. You know, there are certain electorates where people are particularly sensitive about the issue and will vote against a politician who puts up their hand in favour of something like this. There are others, say the inner city, where people are much more relaxed about the concept of gay marriage. I think it's fine. The majority of Australians think it's fine. 62% of people polled recently said it was a good idea. And interestingly, about 80% of young people thought it was too. So it's an idea whose time will come, but not just yet.
Bruce Billson, now you're a politician, and you didn't have much choice in which way you voted on this. The Coalition had a fixed position, no conscience vote. But you obviously voted against it. What is the case against it?
Well, for me, it was quite straightforward. I'd undertaken to vote that way prior to the election. That was the commitment that I took to the electors who I'd asked for their support, and the honourable thing is to do what you say you're going to do.
Why did you take that position?
Well, I took that position because that was my commitment, and also for my community that's quite got some strong feelings either way about it. I think there's certainly scope to have a publicly recognised ceremony for people to celebrate their same-sex relationship. That's fine. I've actually said we should call it a committed life partnership, because I can imagine if you went up to your partner and said, would you be my civil unionist, that doesn't have a whole lot of music in it, but a committed life partnership, that's fine. But the term marriage means so much to so many people. I don't think there's an argument to pinch that term that's been understood and accepted to mean one thing and say, well, it now means something else, and ignore the people that felt very strongly about the institution they'd entered into. So
do you feel it's going to weaken the institution or the value that you place in your marriage as a heterosexual?
No, my marriage is quite strong, but I do recognise that that term characterises the nature of my relationship, and I didn't see the argument that there was a need to use the language marriage to legitimise same-sex relationships. There was no question about illegitimacy for me. I'm more than happy for publicly recognised friends and family declaration of enduring commitment. That's fine, but call it something else, because people feel very strongly about the relationship they went into where marriage meant certain things, and I think that's deserving of respect, and in terms of a way of celebrating publicly other kinds of relationships, well, fine, let's work that through.
Julian, how do you feel about this issue?
Well, I'm with Bruce on this issue. I think that marriage is between a man and a woman. That's not to denigrate anybody who's involved in a same-sex relationship, that they don't love each other as much as people in a marriage, but marriage is an institution with a special place in our society. It's an institution that's thousands of years old. It's an institution that's defined in our constitution as well and had a particular meaning, and I think it means between a man and a woman.
I believe your man, Mr Menzies, once said that something that quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, at some point you have to acknowledge that it's a duck. And I've been to a few beautiful weddings between men and weddings between women, and mums cry and presents are swapped and children are raised happily, and it is what it is. It's a marriage, you know, and to call it anything else, it is a denigration. It is a second-class ceremony.
Well, OK, the arguments, I guess, are pretty well known for and against. What does everyone think about where this is now headed? The vote in the lower house in particular was pretty emphatic.
It's very clear. It was
very clear. And, is it going to come back any time soon, and are those numbers likely to change any time soon?
I'd be surprised if it came back quickly. It was quite an emphatic result, and even in the Senate it was a very strong position where many of the advocates thought it would be much closer. I think it's best to...
And even if there was a conscience vote on your side...
I don't think that would have changed much.
And do you think there will be at some point a conscience vote?
Well, I mean, our policy position is clear and the commitments we made to the electorate are clear, and people honoured that, and I think that's the honourable thing to do. Now, if there's an argument to be had about revisiting the policy, well, there's processes to work that through. But in terms of the Parliament's engagement with it, my sense from my electorate is people think an awful lot of time's been invested in this debate, in this discussion. It's now been voted upon, and I think...
It's an interesting point that Bruce raised before, though, about the polls here, and they do show pretty consistently majority support for gay marriage. And I'm not saying politicians should always follow polls, but it is interesting, isn't it, Julian, when you do see polls consistently showing that and then the Parliament doing something different?
Well, there's two things I'd say about public support for gay marriage. The first thing is just to, and I'm not making a point about the Labor Party here, but just to look, the Labor Party was roughly evenly divided on this question in the House of Representatives, and that, I think, reflects a broader division in our community. Secondly, on polls on this issue, I'd look at the Californian situation. California is one of the more progressive states in the United States, and they had a gay marriage law on the books. They put it to one of their propositions, a citizen-initiated referendum they had there, and it was defeated by a margin of more than, or almost 1 million votes there. So I have a feeling that polls on this are softer than people think they are.
I think one thing's for sure, though, David, until the coalition allows a conscience vote, we're not going to get it through the Parliament. You know, with such a big block of votes, it's just not going to happen.
So is civil unions then, or sorry, was it like...
I called them committed life
partnerships.
Partners. I was told by a gay friend that civil unions didn't really have the music to it that they were looking for. So
partnership does.
I understand. Well, I think it reflects what I'm told by the gay community their relationship is about.
Well, whatever it's called, and some of your colleagues are thinking about putting up a bill along those lines.
Yeah, well,
do you reckon that'll have more success?
Well, I don't think so, because I think Julian touched on the constitutional issues around marriage. Marriage is covered by the Commonwealth. Other types of or descriptors of relationships are covered by the state. So there's a need to have a conversation about how best to work a public declaration recognised before friends and family with all the emotion
Didn't
and
stop you guys
all that
tightening it
that's
up.
there. That's,
Marriage Act didn't used to say
I
man
think
and
that
a
would
woman.
be well happen.
And the Labor Party voted in favour of it when those amendments were made back in 2006,
No, I'm
2007.
simply making the point that the Act hasn't been immune to review in the past, and it shouldn't remain immune to review in the future.
I see the same-sex marriage advocates are saying they'll campaign pretty hard against any civil union bill. They see that as a retrograde step. It's all or nothing, essentially. Cass, what do you think about that?
Look, I actually think that it's insulting to the broader community to keep characterising this as something that only sophisticated inner-city, tertiary-educated, occasional Greens voters really get. My husband had a seat in the Sutherland Shire for 2 terms, and at the beginning of those terms there were laws passed in New South Wales to equalise the age of consent. There were laws passed around adoption, a range of same-sex provisions in superannuation and various other kinds of law. At every turn he was threatened by certain people in the community to hold their votes out if he supported the gay community, but in the end, people in the community in every part of the country have got nephews, nieces, neighbours, working colleagues, friends. There is no gay community. There's our community and the gay men and women who are in it.
I think it's true. I think public opinion is ahead of political opinion on this issue, but that's not all that unusual, really. I think when you do get issues where people are prepared to change their vote on an issue, then you really do have to have overwhelming support in the parliament before you're going to get that acknowledgement that the public is actually supportive of, but key sectors of the community probably feeling very unhappy about. I think that's a shame, but that's the reality that we're dealing with.
Now, it was Corey Bernardi, the Liberal senator, who stole a lot of the thunder on this when he made the remarks in the Senate debate about the prospect of gay marriage possibly leading to other things, whether it's polygamy or even bestiality. Now, Bruce Billson, what went through your head when you heard those remarks?
Well, I didn't think it added anything to what's an important debate. I found them offensive. I thought other people would, and I didn't think it added much. And for an individual with the calibre of Corey, I didn't think it reflected well on him either.
Were you surprised?
I was. He's a bright person, Corey, very able.
He's got some pretty strong views on various things, though.
But that's true, and many in the parliament have strong views. But there's an awareness of how to present those views with sensitivity to those that might not share them. And Corey displays that ordinarily, and on this occasion I don't think he did himself any favours. I don't think he did his case any favours, and I can understand why a number of people found those remarks offensive.
Is there room, Julian, for those sort of views, do you think, in the Liberal Party? He has lost his job on the front bench. He had to walk the plank for this ill-discipline and offensive remark, as Tony Abbott's called it. But Corey Bernardi's still not backing away from those comments. He's not apologising or regretting or retracting them at all. Is there room in the party for that sort of view?
Look, the Liberal Party is a broad church, and this isn't the first sort of remark that Corey Bernardi's made that tends towards the offensive, if I could put it that way. He's made similar sort of statements about Muslims in the past. I always think that part of participation in public debate is trying to convince the unconvinced. And I think if you're making your pitch, as he did, at an extreme right wing of a particular polity, I don't think that you actually bring the undecided people with you. And I'm not sure that they're not views I support. Those views in the Liberal Party are not views in the Liberal Party I'd like to hear a lot of.
Bruce Hawker, Tony Abbott did deal with this pretty swiftly and effectively, didn't he?
I think he had to. He had no choice. I mean, public opinion would have just been visceral if they'd kept him in that position. I mean, it was such a silly comment by any standard and offensive, that he couldn't have stayed there. And I think Abbott did the right thing. I don't think he had any choice but to get rid of him, just as I think Howard removed him from...
Turnbull, actually.
Turnbull. On an earlier occasion.
Yeah.
So, I guess there's room for people on the backbench who have these views. I hope they don't advance to the front bench when they've got those sorts of views. I mean, really, he runs the risk of making his own party a bit of a laughing stock.
There are, Cass, however, people who do agree with Corey Bernardi on this, aren't there? You know,
Indeed,
this isn't just a
I
small...
want Tory Bernardi to do is exercise the discipline and restraint that Abbott is urging on him. I look forward to him saying exactly what he thinks as often as he likes.
Well, Tony Abbott did say the place for
only...
freelancing is on the backbench, so...
Yeah, but the problem with politics at the moment is so many of us are worried that the politicians who are asking for our vote are not being entirely straight with us about what they think. And the thing about Corey is I know perfectly well exactly why I would never vote for him, and I'm entitled to know that about everybody else in the parliament as well. The last thing that I want is manufactured restraint, where there should be open discussion that allows the voters to have a clear picture of who's representing them.
Free speech. At the end of the day, Tony Abbott did manage to turn it into a slight positive by promoting Jamie Briggs and Arthur Sinodinos to the front bench. I don't think anyone's going to argue that they weren't good promotions.
It was a great boost to the intellectual capital of the front bench there with,
Swapping
with Arthur
Arthur
and
for
Jamie.
Corey.
Well, and Jamie as well. I think he's made a good... I think both of them have made a good contribution and they'll continue to do so.
Yeah, I think that's probably right on balance, but I don't know that it helped the opposition with this emerging argument that's being heard now that they're divided internally, and that there've been some real examples of that in recent time, particularly with Barnaby Joyce and his comments about Cubby Station and a couple of other issues as well.
Well, just on that, before we change topic completely, Bruce, has it been a messy couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks for the coalition?
Look, I think there's been issues at play where people have had strong views and have been worked through. That's a good thing. That's where, in the party room, in the discussions that we have about policy positions, their implementation, calibrating our commitments and our messaging, that involves a range of different opinions.
But Tony Abbott's had to really drive home the point the last couple of days, hasn't he, about discipline, guys? Come on, discipline.
Well, but I think that's part of what all oppositions face. I mean, there's a terrific team of very committed men and women doing their best to bring better government to the country, and that involves discipline. That's just the nature of it. I mean, Bruce, in his strategising, would know that that's important. It's important for the opposition. I don't think there's any surprises in that, and I certainly think us staying very focused on getting a great country, a better government is what it's about, and that involves discipline, so it's a perfectly understandable responsibility on all of us, in my view.
Well, speaking about a great country, many were disturbed by last weekend's riots in Sydney. We're going to take a look at that after the break and the fallout as religious and political leaders try and grapple with what's going on. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're joined this week by Julian Leeser, the former Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, Labor strategist Bruce Hawker, Cassandra Wilkinson, an author and columnist, and also the Shadow Minister for Small Business, Bruce Billson. I want to turn to the Sydney riot that took place last weekend on Saturday. Throughout the week we've seen various Muslim leaders and political leaders condemn the violence that was involved, defend the spirit of multiculturalism in Australia. But is there a deeper issue here that's being ignored? What leads to this sort of behaviour? What's disenfranchised these mostly young men to behave in this way? Julian, what do you think?
I think we have to remember the incident in context too. This is part of a series of protests that have happened all around the world about a particular film. One of the challenges of globalisation and the internet and so on is that a problem somewhere becomes a problem everywhere.
And it's a very good point, because in particular, when you say a problem, I mean, I haven't seen the film, but presumably it's a very low-budget, amateurish internet film.
I have. It's hilarious, not for good reasons, but it's...
Well, this is what I'm getting at. It's probably a joke of a thing, right?
You can't take it seriously.
But how does something like that gets online then suddenly sparks all of this violence, and even in Libya, the death of the American ambassador?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the good things about liberal democracy is that you're able to have some degree of free speech there, and you can challenge religious orthodoxies, and and that's of any religion. I remember a few years ago there was the discussion of that artist who did the painting Piss Christ, which was a depiction of Jesus behind a veil of urine. And
some have made this comparison this week, haven't they? That there wasn't similar violent outrage.
No, and I actually think that the violence in the protests does the cause of the people who are concerned and upset about these films and this attacks on their religion a great deal of harm. I think that, I'm not sure that protest really in an Australian context, and certainly not violent protest, ever achieves political action, the political changes.
Is there a, without wanting to generalise here, is there a different understanding of what free speech means in the parts of the Middle East in particular, where they don't have the free speech rights that we do in the West?
Look, I can't answer that, but all I can say is that I think you need to be able to have some sort of debate. From what I've seen, the reports of the film that Cassandra's seen is that it's a pretty bad film, but I think that the reaction is out of all proportion to the film itself.
Cass, what do you think was...
I don't think the violence has the slightest bit to do with the film. I mean, the film is an offensive piece of nonsense, obviously, but it's... This is a group of people looking for a reason to get upset.
So this was an excuse?
Yeah, the film has... I mean, everyone has to learn to take a joke about their religion. The Christians have put up with Last Temptation of Christ, with Mel Gibson being Christian at all and humiliating them constantly. The Mormons have got the Book of Mormon happening at the moment. The Jews have had to have a sense of humour for a very long time. And one of the beautiful things in Australia is the reason we all get to do our own thing is because we don't interfere with other people doing their own thing. And I just don't think that we can allow this film to introduce any kind of a provocation defence. There should be no allowable provocation defence here. Religion has to remain in the private sphere. It cannot become part of the way that we govern, and that's essentially what the people who organised it are arguing for. They don't want free speech. They have no intention of advocating for free speech wherever they want to be or here.
Bruce Billson, it does pose a challenge, though, to politicians on all sides, doesn't it, to look at what's going on in these communities?
Well, a couple of things. I thought we were way past provocation as an excuse for unlawful behaviour. I thought we'd passed that. So I don't buy that as an explanation. I think the effort of many Muslim leaders should be commended for saying this is not the way one raises a difference of opinion or a grievance. I mean, we're all in this country and we've all made a commitment to each other. And let's go back to basics. To be a citizen here, we pledge our support to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs we share, whose rights and liberties we respect, and whose laws we will uphold and obey. That's the deal we all make with each other. That's the deal. And I don't think that's negotiable. I think we should be prepared to assert the value of that outlook. This is an expectation, a responsibility and a blessed opportunity for all of us to live here. But that's the deal. And everyone should be accountable for operating within that framework, regardless of their religion. And let's get past this. I've been provoked. That's history as a justification for unlawful behaviour, in my view.
And Bruce Hawker, do you think this has in any way been a failure of multiculturalism here?
Well, I don't know that it has been, actually. There are something like 500,000 Muslims in Australia, and we didn't see 500,000 on the streets. There was a very small number. And within that demonstration, I think there were some people who were very upset at the way the demonstration became violent. So my view about this is that the overwhelming majority of Muslims are family people that just want to get on with life. They probably have stricter religious constraints put on them than we do in other religions, if you have a religion. But I don't think that they would be putting their hand up for that sort of behaviour. You see those sort of minority groups everywhere. We saw those World Trade Organisation demonstrations in Australia just a few years ago, really violent reactions. There are some people who will always revert to violence, who are fundamentally anti-democratic in nature. But I would say this also, that I think that the leaders of the Muslim community and broader church and other groups responded pretty well after this outburst of violence. It could have got very ugly. We saw, an ugly turn of events in Cronulla a few years ago around Christmas, and we didn't see that this time. There wasn't that really horrible sort of response. I think people had a reasonably mature reaction, and that was, well, actually the strength of our system is that we can tolerate this sort of thing from time to time and deal with it and rise above it and let the courts deal with the people who acted.
It does sound like a genuinely bipartisan support then for multiculturalism and the principles of what you sign up for as an Australian, and those core principles. But in Parliament this week, Bruce Billson, we did see the Coalition go on the attack over the government's decision to let into the country, for a visit at least, of a leader of the Hizb ut-Tahrir group, Taji Mustafa, who the Coalition argues should not have been allowed into the country. What was the aim of going on the attack over this? Was it to suggest that Labor's been weak on when it comes to hardline Islamic extremism?
Well, it seemed as though the minister was asleep at the wheel. There are mechanisms available to the minister to deny entry to Australia for people who are judged not to be deserving of the opportunity to come. Now, that's what it's about. There was some history and some conduct surrounding that individual that gave great concern to whether he'd satisfy the character tests and whether the minister had in fact exercised his responsibility to make sure that it was appropriate to offer the visa to that individual. That was what the debate was about. And it took days to get the minister to come out and say, look, I did look at that. We still don't know whether he looked at it retrospectively or whether he was forced to look at it or whether he did make a considered judgment that there was no character issue here. We were simply highlighting the fact that there are tools available to the minister to make sure people of good character come to the country.
Doesn't there have to be some sort of hard evidence of how he fails the character test?
Oh, absolutely, and that was what was put to the minister. Evidence of the preachings or teachings or calls to action that the individual had been involved with previously. That was put before the minister. He was incapable of answering that for 2 days and went back to a proscription of a particular organisation when really the issue was this particular individual and his conduct, and that seemed to be something the minister couldn't quite turn his mind to until well into the week. That was what we were pursuing. The minister needs to be accountable for his responsibilities, and that was a legitimate line of inquiry that the Coalition pursued.
It didn't seem that legitimate to the New South Wales Police, who were the ones who were asked to form a view on whether there was a crime in the mix in any of those complaints. And I mean, come on, there's been no shortage. I've certainly been happy to get stuck into Bowen on occasion, but in this instance, you know what makes us better than those people? We believe in free speech. And we believe in the argument that free speech is a cheap shout if it doesn't include offensive speech. I mean, that's the whole point, right? If you don't tolerate offensive speech, you're not really tolerating anything at all.
Well,
if that bloke does something, if he does something, anything to incite action, then he should be arrested and deported. But the fact is, our belief in free speech is what makes us better than those people. If Bowen stooped to keeping him out just because of things that he said, then we would be reducing ourselves to their level.
Cassandra, your answer was more assertive than the minister's. If all of that is true...
he doesn't have that luxury, does he?
Well, he does, and he has an enormous number of staff and the opportunity to consult the authorities. And if he'd arrived at a considered view of the kind you're presenting, why didn't he say so?
The issue is not whether I make the argument better, it's whether you agree.
Well, no, I think I don't think anyone could dispute. If the minister had arrived at that considered view, gee, he fogged that pretty well for a few days. If he had done that analysis, arrived at the point that you'd arrived at and consulted the authorities, well, he should have said so. Instead, he fudged, he obfuscated. He then went off to talk about a proscription of an organisation.
And I think that was of Mill and Menzies failed to understand the free speech issue that was at the heart of the question.
No, this was about ministerial responsibility, and that a minister, if he was so clear and considered in the conclusion that you're suggesting he arrived at, he made a real hash of getting that across in the Parliament, where the Parliament was expecting him to be accountable for his responsibilities, and he failed miserably.
But that is the stuff of opposition, though. You know, I've got no issue with that. If you want to take a point with a minister and hold him to account on that, that's fine. But at the end of the day, I don't think any evidence was adduced which would have him change his view. But I don't think there's anything.
To have one, Bruce,
well, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking it. I don't think there's anything wrong with him saying, well, we go through these processes. I think he said he'd proscribed something like 29 individuals. I can't remember the exact number, but they go through a process. And as far as I'm aware, that was a process which went through here as well. But you know, if you're the opposition, you would probably try to take a point on this sort of thing and score against the government. That's what opposition's about.
But I know it's a novel idea. The question time is supposed to be about those accountability processes, about probing the minister and his or her role and how well they're across their brief. And there's a reason why now it's called question time, not question and answer time. There wasn't a lot of answers there, and that was what deserved further inquiry.
We should have Malcolm Turnbull on discuss question time.
Just getting back
He's got a few views.
Getting away from the specific of Taji Mustafa and back to the broader issue. In the wake of that riot last weekend, is there a danger that there will be a hardening of attitudes towards Muslims more generally in Australia? And is there a role, not just for those Muslim leaders, but for politicians to step up on this?
Well, I hope there's not a hardening of attitudes towards all Muslims, because that's completely unreasonable. We've all grown up with Muslim members of our community and our network. There are Muslims serving in the military. There are Muslims doing terrific work every day, upholding those key commitments we make to each other about a lawful, democratic, respectful society. It would be wrong to label all, but I think what we need to do is celebrate that contribution and recognise its value, but where people of whatever faith
and serving in the Australian Parliament as well. Ed Husick,
that's right.
I mean, a real up-and-comer in the Labor Party. You know, there will always be people who will take opportunities like this to, run their particular line, their particular prejudice, or whatever. I think the test of any civilised community is their ability to deal with it, to rise above it. And I think on balance, notwithstanding a few shock jocks and others getting excited about it around the country, that Australians passed that test in the last week.
I'm not sure I quite agree with that. I think when the Herald puts an editorial on the front page saying we've had a gutful, then I think something has changed. And it's true that it's appalling that the vast majority of proud Australian citizens who are Muslim get caught up in this. But I think there was a change in the tone, and the fact that the Fairfax and ABC people got caught up in this, you know what? It's really time to say that we're not going to have any Charlie Hebdo here. We're not going to have any cartoonists burned in Australia. We have to say it's not that kind of place, and you need to chill out or deal with your issues.
I think successful multiculturalism is a two-way street, and there is a role that politicians can play. I remember after the Cronulla riots, I think it was Scott Morrison and Jason Clare, a Liberal and a Labor member, got together with some people who are locals in the Cronulla surfing community and from and with some of the Muslims and Muslim young people, and put them together and started doing some work with them to try and. I think they did do the Kokoda train together, absolutely. And if we're going to build a stronger country, it's actually individual by individual getting involved in communities and reaching across to people who you don't have anything in common with and doing something that's non-political, non-religious. That ultimately builds the stronger society.
Well, sure.
Lots of politicians
if we value all that are happy and positive about living within that contract we all have with each other as citizens, regardless of their faith or whether they have no faith at all, or whether they're Caliphumpian, if they play by that commitment we've all made to each other, they should be welcome, and we need to make sure there's space for those people, Muslims of all faiths, but for whatever background, nature, faith, creed, people disrespect what it is to be an Australian. We need to be equally vigilant in saying, no, that's not the go.
Yeah,
I think that's what we need to reassert.
Okay. There might be agreement on that. We need to take another break. There's no agreement on where the budget is headed. A fair bit of argument, heated argument in the Parliament over government spending commitments. Where's the money coming from? Stay with us. Welcome back. We're joined this week by the former Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, Julian Leeser, Labor strategist Bruce Hawker from Campaigns and Communications, Cassandra Wilkinson, author, columnist, former Labor staffer, and the Shadow Minister for Small Business, Bruce Billson. As I mentioned at the start of the show, we were to be joined tonight by the Veterans Affairs Minister, Warren Snowden. He had to pull out at the very last minute because of some family issues. Now, I want to look at what was a big focus in Parliament today, and that was this week. And that was the government spending commitments, whether they're writing cheques they can't cash, whether the budget surplus, which is wafer thin at $1.5 billion, is really still going to be achieved. Bruce Hawker, to you first. We have seen a lot of commitments. Admittedly, things like the Gonski education reforms, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, involve spending that's a long way off, stretched over many, many years. Nonetheless, they are starting to pile up. The dental scheme as well. We know that the asylum seeker issue is costing the budget more. We know the commodity prices have fallen. Government revenues will be down. Surely you must be thinking, is this budget surplus really going to happen?
Well, it's dependent on other things as well. You know, it's receipts from other exports and so forth. So it's always going to be a bit of a question mark as to whether you make it or not. I think the opposition's got to make this an issue, frankly, because interestingly, Tony Abbott is a big spending opposition leader. We've seen him come out and match commitments on carbon, for example, but through a budget. We've seen him come out and say he's going to still give small business a tax cut, but not through a tax.
For the government, though, this is going to be tough because you know, Wayne Swan and others have been the last few weeks done nothing but launch into Campbell Newman and Barry O'Farrell.
I think it is going to be tough.
So now he's facing the very real prospect, well, he's going to have to, isn't he, make some pretty big cuts of his own?
Well, they're going to be looking for savings all over the place. I've got absolutely no doubt about that, and it's important that they get a balanced budget. I think it's going to be challenging in the circumstances, but they've got to try to get there. But I can also understand why they're focusing on issues like the dental scheme, like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which Tony Abbott supports, and Gonski, even though that's further down the line, because they are Labor issues, they're Labor values, and I think they really needed to reassert those traditional Labor values. The Liberals, they'll do what they always do and say, where's the money coming from, and look to cut. But in doing so, they run the risk of being said that, well, you're another Campbell Newman, you're another Barry O'Farrell.
We'll get Bruce Billson's response, but Cass, this line of where's the money coming from, it's not just Tony Abbott. Julia Gillard, as the opposition have been pointing out this week, did say herself, not all that long ago, that when you make an announcement, you should explain how you're going to pay for it.
Yep. Look, I couldn't agree more. I'd like both of them to say where the money is coming from because, as Bruce said, Abbott's had no shortage of announcements. He's all but agreed to do Medicare dental, the NDIS, defence spending. There's a number of other things. And the thing that I get worked up about in this is that it assumes that money is the solution to every problem. You know, the tragedy in Gonski is that we're not discussing the fact that we've doubled per child expenditure in education and we've got declining literacy, we've got declining numeracy. Money is not a policy. Money is part of a policy, sure, but you know the lack of evidence in dealing with our acute problems, whether it's in the restructuring of healthcare, you know, we're bleeding money all through the public hospitals and Medicare. We've got Australians are paying a third of their health expenses out of pocket in a system that's supposed to have free healthcare. That's how structurally disjointed this is, and what I want to see from anybody please, is policies on Medicare, dental, NDIS. Show me how it's going to work, show me where the evidence is, show me the regulatory structures. At the moment it's just a battle of the biggest cheque, and the fact is we've been making bigger and bigger cheques for 20 years now, and in education it hasn't made anything better.
Bruce Billson. We've seen the...
I'm glad you differentiated me from Bruce Hawker because, I mean, Bruce...
I think we both are.
Well, I mean,
I'm sure you do take issue with...
Well, I do. I mean, there's a couple of things. The Labor line needs to settle somewhere. At one stage, there's no policies from the coalition. At the next stage, well, there's too many policies from the coalition. They need to make up their mind. But we are in that space where I think the Gillard Labor government will say whatever it needs to do to achieve a holdout from Kevin Rudd, so there's an internal sort of coherence and the Prime Minister's position secured, and then in what seems to be a very desperate effort to reconnect with the base of the Labor Party that seems to be leaving them in droves. And one of the things that I think Cassandra's touched on that I think is worthy of further examination is the structural deficit that's already in the budget. I mean, the argument is there's about a $40 billion structural deficit where fluctuating revenue streams we can't be certain about have actually been spent and spent again in forward expenditure commitments. On top of that, we now have all of these announcements, some of them on the Never Never, and a fictitious surplus that was contrived to begin with. Remember the fudging of pulling forward expenditure into the last financial year, so that deficit was a behemoth, and then pushing things out the other end. I mean, I think what you'll find is we'll never see a surplus from this government.
So just to
There'll be
tease that out, though, should governments only make commitments relating to the forward estimates, to the 4 years, or should they be more visionary and long-term?
Well, you can be visionary, but that doesn't mean you're given a leave pass on being accountable in the short term, and that's the difficulty the government faces. It was all about Gonski, and then there was 3,000 schools that would get less funding. Oh, well, it's not about Gonski, it's Gonski plus, and no real accounting for how that would happen. Other announcements have been made. We've got subs that we're apparently going to build. You know, there's commitments on dental, but then there's this hiatus of service
But it does
in
cut
between.
both ways, doesn't it? I mean, the opposition's made a whole stack of promises.
Well, and we are costing our policies. We want to under-promise and over-deliver. We've delivered surpluses before. We've restored budget integrity. Our fiscal position really needs to be tidied up because it's having ramifications right throughout the economy. Better targeted policies, not policies that then look for the evidence to back them up, to say, see, this was a good idea. That's what the government's doing at the moment. There needs to be more discipline. There needs to be more focus.
Do feel free to explain your plan for carbon then.
Yeah, $27 billion is the figure, I don't think anyone really disputes, that the opposition would have to come up with to compensate businesses for carbon.
Well, I think everybody disputes those numbers. What is different about the coalition's position is we lay out our policies and how they're funded.
Well,
what's
okay,
not
Julian,
happening from the
bring you in
government
here. Is there a way to get through this very repetitive argument that comes around every election cycle? The Parliamentary Budget Office was supposed to be the way to take some of this back and forth out of the mix. Doesn't seem to be working, though.
I was attracted to the idea of the Parliamentary Budget Office. They have one in Canada now, and the experience in Canada hasn't been all that good. I'm not sure that a Parliamentary Budget Office actually works all that well, grafted onto a Westminster system. It's obviously an idea that's come from the system in Washington, where you've got the Congressional Budget Office and Congress is responsible for the budget, and you have more independent arms of the legislature. In Canada, what they found, they appointed a former Auditor General. He's taken a particular view of his functions there that I think has lost the confidence of both sides there, and I don't think it's been a particularly useful thing, and I'm not sure...
So we're stuck with this endless debate.
Well, I'm not sure we are. You look at what's happened. Everybody's saying the budget's in trouble, bar one person. That's Wayne.
Well,
and he's never nailed a budget for years. He's missed every one he's done.
Let me point out what the IMF has had to say. This has just come out tonight. It's talking about the Australian government's fiscal strategy. It does strike a balance between the need to limit both public and external debt increases while containing any adverse impact on economic growth. It's a pretty big tick for the budget settings of this government.
That seems to be an endorsement of what's being said. But it's all about the execution. It's all about the execution. Remember Wayne Swan says our revenues weren't what we expected because he inflates them every year. He always overestimates and then says, what a surprise.
And they'd all want to be...
haven't been magnificent.
There isn't a country in the Northern Hemisphere that wouldn't want to have our
and then there's an effort to shift the argument away from the fundamental huge budget problem the government has now, that it's making bigger, that everyone agrees it's in trouble, and Wayne Swan will fudge the mid-year financial and economic outlook because that's his document, use that as the frame from which to prepare for an election, and then we might see some facts when the Treasury rather than the Treasurer's numbers are released, and then we'll get some facts on the table.
To point out, though, before we move on, that mid-year budget update is done with Treasury's figures, not the Treasurer's figures.
No, the Treasury contribute to them, but the final settings and the assumptions are the Treasurer's work.
Yes, but
the only unadulterated work of Treasury is the pre-election financial outlook, and I'm sure everybody will be very interested in reading that.
Okay, but just to be clear, the figures, the projections on whether we're going to hit a surplus or not, that's done by Treasury.
No. The mid-year economic and fiscal outlook is the Treasurer's document.
A few Treasury secretaries would be pretty offended to hear what you just said.
I'm pretty sure Treasury
I'm sure I'll
stamps
provide
the...
some stuff, but that's the Treasurer's document.
All
and
right,
all
so
you need to
when
do is
he
look at
produces
those.
the mid-year budget update, when Peter Costello always produced them,
We should have a
they
look
weren't
at the
from Treasury.
assumptions.
Is that what you're saying?
No, that's the Treasurer's document. Treasury provide
so
material.
they didn't have Treasury.
And the Treasurer
They didn't have
has
Treasury
the final
approval.
say on them. Well, Treasury contributes, but
Can I
let's be
tell you,
clear
I've
on the
worked
final
on a few
product.
budgets, and not even the Treasurer's speech is not the work of Treasury. Treasury are knee-deep in every single line and every single number, and I think any Treasury Secretary would be pretty horrified to be told
Let's
that
move
a
on.
significant document wasn't theirs.
I do want to also discuss the government's announcement today that it's essentially shelving or delaying a referendum on whether we should recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution. This was something the government pledged as part of its deal with the Greens and Independents in forming minority government to have a referendum at or before the next election in 2013. It commissioned an expert panel of Indigenous and non-Indigenous leaders. They worked up some recommendations that went to the government, told them the way to do this. There have been disagreements, though, over the wording, over what exactly what form this constitutional recognition should take. And now the government has decided it's best to put it off until after the next election. In the meantime, it will have what it's calling an act of recognition put before Parliament, a piece of legislation that won't obviously change the Constitution. Indigenous leaders seem pretty okay with this, that it was perhaps going to be a bit ambitious to get it done so quickly. Is it a bit embarrassing, though, Cass, that this was a promise made?
I think it might be slightly overstating things to say that Indigenous leaders are happy with this turn of events. I suspect they're happy not to get defeated, which is what would have happened had it gone forward at the moment.
The situation we're in now, not to put it up to a vote.
Yeah, and look, I just say I think it's a bit depressing what passes for groundbreaking policy here now. I mean, think back to WIC. And think back to the fears people had of their backyards being subject to native title claims. Think back to the land rights cases where the country had serious fears about Aboriginal claims of sovereignty getting out of hand, having genuine impacts on property rights and economic development. What we're talking about here is the most modest and constrained recognition of a First People, and somehow this seems more than the Parliament can get its head around.
Why is it so divisive?
Look, I think you need to look at this in its context, and it goes back before this government. It goes back to John Howard on the eve of the 2007 election suggesting this, and this was really a sort of an alternative to the apology. Now, given that the apology's happened, I actually think the whole debate has shifted. In terms of constitutional recognition, it's a difficult issue because, A, you've got to get agreement of Indigenous people, because it's not helpful to have a campaign where you've got some Indigenous people saying, you know, this is a bad proposal, and others saying that it's not. You've got to have agreement across all the states. There has to be a groundswell of public opinion. But even if you put words in the Constitution, the big question is what's a High Court judge in a future case going to do with the particular words, and how will that affect their interpretation of legislation?
I think that's absolutely right, that you need agreement amongst key Indigenous leaders. I think that was largely there, but you also need political commitment as well, don't you? And when you look at the various things that have dominated the focus of our politicians during this term of Parliament, whether it's Craig Thompson's credit card, Peter Slipper's cab charges, Julia Gillard's time at Slater and Gordon, or Tony Abbott's university days, is it fair to say not a lot of effort has gone into promoting this cause? Bruce Billson?
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, in fact, as Julian's outlined, the coalitions instigated a referenda on recognition in the preamble, very supportive, been as collaborative and cooperative as we can be with the government, but I think you're absolutely right. It's fair to say building of momentum for support hasn't peaked early. In fact, the announcement today struck me and others as I wonder how that has been going, because there was so little airplay, so little preparation, explaining to the community what this is about. I think putting it off was sensible, but it also reflects a lack of momentum in the leader.
Bruce Hawker, what do you put this down to? Was it always too ambitious, particularly in a hung Parliament, to try and get this up?
Yeah, well, it may have been, but I suspect also it comes down to the people who are driving it and how much effort they're able to put into it, how much support they've got for it. It's a little tougher than some other referendum issues, probably for average Australians, and we know that it's very hard to get a referendum up.
I think only 8 out of 44.
Yeah, very rare.
So it's going to be tough whenever it happens, but let's see if it does happen in the next term of Parliament. Not going to happen in this one. We're out of time for this evening's show. Julian Leeser, Bruce Hawker, Cassandra Wilkinson, Bruce Billson, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for your company as well. We'll be back same time next week. See you then.